Okay, well, before we start talking about the Metzorah part, which is this double Parsha, it's one that brings up so many questions because of the detail and what's going on is just pretty much incomprehensible. But we'll, through Shimshon Raphael Hirsch's analysis, we'll make sense of it. But before, I want to say, spend a few minutes on what I heard. I don't have it in the PowerPoint because I just heard it yesterday in shul from Rabbi Finkelstein in our shul, who gave a drasha, and I want to share it with you because it addresses a question that everybody has every year, and that is when you read the first part of the parsha, which is Tazria. It describes what happens when a woman gives birth. And it says if it's a boy, it's a certain amount of weeks of Tumah. If it's a girl, it's twice the amount of weeks of Tumah. And that's also a question, how come the difference between the two? Hirsch does answer that, but that's not the point. The big question everybody has is why at the end of the period of Tumah of childbirth, why does she have to bring a korban chatat? I mean, there are actually two questions. Why does childbirth cause tuma? And that I don't think we've discussed the whole idea of tuma and tara. And I think in the coming weeks, when this theme is a thread through all of the Parshiot of Vayikra, we'll talk more about what the concept of is tuma and tara. But the focus is that last thing. Why would a woman who gives birth, which in Judaism is an extremely positive thing to have children? It's part of the biblical mission of the Jewish people. It's considered a bracha. Fertility is a bracha. And the idea that after birth she has to bring a korban chatat is not comprehensible. So, a number of people even from the time of the Gemara, they tried to answer that, and one of the main um, responses that we read in the Gemara, I think it's Rabbi Akiva, said the reason she has to bring a chatat is because the childbirth is uh, painful, but also dangerous. Remember, we're talking about a time when infant mortality was very high and maternal mortality was very high. Many women died in childbirth, and certainly many infants died in childbirth. And so the whole experience is a dangerous experience. So according to Rabbi Akiva, he says the reason that the woman has to bring a chatat is because her reaction to giving childbirth, the whole experience, uh, her personal danger, danger to children, the pain of labor and childbirth, all of that put together. It says the words he uses, kafatzta v'nishba. She impulsively makes a oath, and the oath is, I don't want to go through this again. I'm not having any more children. And because she made such a impulsive oath, she has to bring a chatat to sort of apologize or make up for having made that vow that she's not going to have many more children. So Rabbi Finkelstein points out, what the focus is usually on the second part, that it's because she makes a vow. But he puts the focus on the first part, the word uh, kafatz, which means to act impulsively. And he associates it with a incident in the beginning of the book of Ezra, when you remember Ezra and Nehemiah were the time when Cyrus gave permission for the Jews to go back after 70 years to go back and rebuild Yerushalayim and rebuild the temple. Now, of course, if you remember in the book of Ezra, when they describe the building of the second temple, this is way before Herod makes this beautiful temple. The temple that they rebuilt was sort of a shack. It was very small. They were focusing on trying to protect it by building walls around the Har Habayit, um, but the temple itself was really not a temple. It was a very small structure and very primitive structure. They didn't have the Aron HaKodesh from the first Beit HaMikdash. They didn't have the golden menorah from the first Beit HaMikdash. They didn't have the shulchan or the golden incense. They made it out of wood. They made it out of other metals, and so it was like a makeshift temple as they were beginning to build the structure. So what is described in Ezra is that the elderly people who came back to Yerushalayim sat and mourned in Yerushalayim, looking at the temple. They mourned and they said, "Oh, we remember. We were children, but we remember the first temple, and it was so magnificent, and the vessels and the all of the golden things and everything was magnificent, and we don't have that anymore." And they sat there mourning. And the book goes on to describe the younger people, the ones who were born after the second temple, the first temple was destroyed, and now have come back. The young men were joyous because they said, "Well, okay, but we're building a new temple. This is the beginning of a reestablishment of the temple, which means God's presence is going to return to Yerushalayim," and they were overjoyed. So what's the difference between the two? It's the same event, but it's how you look at the event. You can look at the event and look back and turn it into pessimism and mourning and sadness, or you can look at the same event and you turn it into optimism and you look forward and you're joyful. And so he says that's what is happening with Tazria. That's what's happening with the description of the woman who gives birth. When it says kofatz v'nishba, the kofatz, her immediate impulsive reaction is to focus on the negative, is to saying, "No, this is painful, this is dangerous, I don't want to do this again, I'm never going to do this again, I don't want to." It's a look backwards in the negative. While what she should have done, and what the Torah would like the mother to do when she gives birth, is to look forward and to be optimistic and say, "Well, here is another child that I'm adding to the family, and another child we're adding to Am Yisrael, and thank God for the opportunity to have another child and to increase my family." So because her impulsive reaction was on the negative side, that's why she brings the korban chatat. So that's a very interesting explanation, and I think it's probably one of the most reasonable explanations of why the Torah has the woman bring a chatat. It's how she responded to the childbirth, not the fact that she experienced the childbirth.
It's very
Okay. So
yes,
now,
Steve. Thank you for sharing that. I that seems to make a lot more sense to me than yesterday. I heard someone talk about how it's for the future sins that child rearing is going to inevitably cause a woman to do, because everybody has things that they've lost their patience, or just
right,
countless examples that child
right.
rearing.
That's
Um,
true. It's. I don't think it's as uh, convincing an answer
right,
as his answer. And besides, there are many parents who have wonderful kids and have no problem with their kids and enjoy
right,
raising the kids. So it's not an inevitable thing. But
right.
in any case, it's everybody has to attempt to answer the question. Okay, so now let's go to the Metzorah part. And the Metzorah part is fascinating, and it begs, as the expression goes, it calls out Darsheni, explain me, explain what's going on here. On the one hand, people see this as a medical treatise on a dermatological condition of the ancient Near East. In other words, most people, whether it's Jewish commentators or Christian commentators, see these two parshiot and all its detail as describing some type of uh, dermatological condition, which was labeled in the translation, the original translation of the Septuagint into Greek. It was called leprosy, and which is a condition in the ancient Near East. Uh, but the problem is that the Torah is not a medical treatise. It doesn't deal with medical things. And so to assume that this is a chapters that describe a condition that needs to be treated, that just it doesn't fit in a book of moral education. It doesn't fit in what the Torah is as a guide to moral behavior if you're looking at it in that way. Just like we talked about when the details of the Mishkan were covering 4 chapters and repeating the same things over and over again. The Torah is not a book of engineering and interior design. There's got to be more to it than that, and that's what Hirsch focused on, of what's the symbolic nature of the Mishkan that teaches us something. So it's going to be the same approach here. What is this trying to teach us, as opposed to describing some type of medical problems and diseases? In fact, I don't know if you guys have it. I still have one. Rabbi Hertz's Chumash. It was produced in 1940, and it was uh, before all of the Humashim that have come out in the past 40 years. The first one that was a commentary and translation in English was the Hertz Chumash, coming out of of England. In any case, in his comment in this parsha, he says the prominence given to this subject must be due to the prevalence of this class of malady in the Near East. He's approaching it as a disease. Many authorities regard these regulations as based only on sanitary principles. In other words, he explains this whole parshiot of Tazria and Metzorah as describing sanitary principles having to do with this uh, disease called leprosy. A suspected person was isolated for a period of time until his diagnosis became certain, and when he was found to be effective, he was compelled to reside outside the camp. And so he sees this as simply a way that the Bnei Israel dealt with a medical problem. And in fact, the Abarbanel, and I think it was the Ralbag, Gersonides, both approach it in a similar way. They approach it as a description of a disease that needs to be addressed. Okay. However, we're going to take an entirely different track. And there's a reason for it. First of all, why is this not leprosy? Because if you look up leprosy, you Google leprosy, you see it's a chronic, slow progressing bacterial infection that affects the skin and the nerves, especially of the hands and feet and the face. and it destroys the nerve ending, causes the affected areas to lose sensation, and because of this, fingers and toes become infected and mutilated, and in fact can fall off. People who have really leprosy lose their fingers and toes, and they cause deformities. It's also contagious through sores and bodily fluids and bed bugs, and was treated by isolation. And we had one in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem in the late 1800s, before Israel became a state, late 1800s, a doctor called Hansen, Dr. Hansen, opened a house for lepers because people in Jerusalem coming from Egypt and Yemen and Morocco and all these places which had uh, leprosy as a disease, they were in Jerusalem, and he was concerned that the disease could be spread, and so he opened a house for the treatment of leprosy in Jerusalem, and it exists still today. It's called Hansen House. Obviously, it's not a treatment place anymore for leprosy. It's actually a very nice restaurant, and it's a art and design place because it's a beautiful location. But in any case, uh, Jerusalem had its own leper colony. Okay, but what the Torah is describing is not is not leprosy. First of all, the Kohen diagnoses the disease. Now, Kohanim in the Torah have no association with medicine. I mean, there are priests in other religions where the priest is also a doctor or a healer. Okay, the Kohanim are not healers. They have no role in healing any disease. So that's number one. Their focus is on spiritual issues, tameh and tahor being spiritual issues, and doing the service of the Mishkan or the Mikdash. If it's diagnosed as tsarat, we'll call it tsarat. We're not going to call it leprosy anymore. If it's diagnosed as tsarat, the person is isolated for a week. Okay, so that makes sense however you look at it. This is what the Torah describes. If after a week, according to the Torah, if healing begins, if you see that there's these skin disease is starting to heal, then the person is isolated for another week. If after 2 weeks the skin is healed, then he is declared tahor, and he goes out, goes back into the community. Okay, so right away you see this is not leprosy, because it does not disappear after 2 weeks. It's a long disease that goes on for years. Okay, so but this is not what's being described here. Then, which is strange, if the tsarat spreads all over the body, now picture this. If it spreads all over the body, then the Kohen declares him tahor, which means he goes back to the community. But if healing starts to appear, then he's isolated for a week. In other words, he's not isolated if it spreads all over his body, but he is isolated only when the healing process starts. And all of this makes no sense if you're treating a disease. It doesn't fit the data. Clinically, leprosy follows a slow, progressive disease process with a poor prognosis for recovery. But with the disease of tsarat, we see that not only is it curable within a few weeks, but strangely enough, if the disease covers the whole body, the person is not isolated at all, and there is no treatment, and he's declared tahor, spiritually pure, and he goes back into the community, and there's no problem. Which, again, makes no sense. The Kohanim are the ones who diagnose the disease, but there's not only is there no indication, as I mentioned, anywhere in the Torah that they had any knowledge or skill in healthcare, but there is no treatment. They don't treat. Tsarat is not treated. They don't do anything. In terms of the diagnostic procedure, again, this is according to the text. The Kohen only inspects skin which is directly visible to the eye. Skin which is normally covered by clothing is irrelevant. Now, picture you go to your dermatologist, and you want him to check your skin. He doesn't just check the skin that he can see in your face and your hands and your feet. He checks all over your body. He tells you to take off your clothing so he can look at all your skin. Okay, the Kohen does not do that. The Kohen only looks at your face, your hands, and your feet. That is not covered with any clothing. Also, only if healthy skin is forming on the diseased spot is the person considered in need of isolation. If the healing process has not yet started, the person is not declared diseased, is not isolated, and both of these procedures are incomprehensible if we're trying to deal with a diagnosis of a disease or prevent contagion. If you think that this is a contagious disease, it makes no sense that if it spreads all over his body, the person is sent back to the community. Even more strange is the law that during the week of a wedding, Sheva Brachot, or Shabbat, or any festival, when tens of thousands of people, Olei Regel, come to Yerushalayim, the examinations were suspended. In other words, a person having tsarat was just left in the community. He wasn't brought to the Kohen. Certainly, if we're concerned about public health, it's irrational to suspend the diagnostic procedures just at those times when the city is crowded with people or there are crowds of people are together. Think of COVID. In COVID, you didn't have any weddings. You didn't invite people for Shabbat. You didn't celebrate all the festivals publicly because you're afraid of contagion. Here, if you're afraid of a disease that's contagious, it doesn't make any sense that you suspend all rules during the times where there are gatherings of thousands of people. Also, the pasuk says, when diagnosing a case of suspected tsarat that has affected a house, the Torah says the Kohen has to remove all the articles from the house before making the inspection, lest he find the house tameh, and the owner would suffer financial loss because his clothing and his furniture would have to be destroyed. In other words, if there was some type of mold on the rocks, the stones of the house, if the Kohen declared that the house had tsarat, it was affected with this kind of mold, which is similar to a skin disease on a person, he declared it tameh, then everything inside that house had to be destroyed, had to be burned. Okay, so the Kohanim didn't want to do that. So they said, before we declare this house as something having this tsarat mold, take all the furniture out, take all your clothing out, take everything out, and then we'll declare it that way. And meanwhile, you won't suffer any loss. But if the purpose of a diagnosis is to prevent further contagion, removing the infected material to avoid financial loss is foolish. In other words, you're taking the stuff out that could be contaminated if we're talking about some type of a contagious disease. And finally, all these laws of examination and isolation do not apply to non-Jews living in Israel. They only apply to Jews, which is very strange, but that's the halacha. Neither do they apply to rural areas or towns without walls. In other words, the whole idea of tsarat and the Kohanim apply to original walled cities, meaning to large urban populations, places like Yerushalayim, and at the time Yericho and Tazria and other places that were large cities which had walls around them. So these laws are quite strange, since it's obvious that diagnosis and treatment of a disease in the interest of public health has nothing to do with a person's faith, whether he's Jewish or not Jewish, or type of city in which he dwells. Again, think back to COVID. It doesn't matter whether you're Jewish or not Jewish. It doesn't matter where you live. You had the same kind of treatment that you had to isolate yourself. So again, what this all is showing is that if in our conception we're conceiving this tsarat as some type of a disease, whether it's on your body, whether it's in your house, whether it's on your clothing, some type of a moss on your clothing, whatever it is, it doesn't follow the idea that you're treating a disease and you're trying to prevent its spread, its contagion. In other words, you're looking in the wrong conception if you're looking at it as a disease that needs to be treated in some way. So now the big question is, well, then what is it? And if it's not a disease, a physical disease, a dermatological disease, or a disease of mold in a house or on clothing, so what is it? So again, using Hirsch's methodology, what we have to do is find out where we find tsarat elsewhere in the Torah besides here. Okay, so by doing that, we then try to find the common thread and then come back to all of these strange characteristics and see if the characteristics now fit this new way of looking at it. Okay, so now take a look. Where in the Torah do we have tsarat again? So only in one place in the Chumash, and that is in Devarim. And in Devarim we have the reiteration of Tuma and Tara, and there's a statement in the midst of the discussion of Tuma and Tara. It says, in the cases of tsarat, be very careful to do as the Kohanim tell you to do. You must follow what I have commanded them. And then it says, remember what God, your God, did to Miriam along the way after you came out of Egypt. It's referring to an event where you remember back in Bamidbar, where Miriam spoke against her brother Moshe, and the consequence was that she got tsarat. So what was that event? So Miriam, this is in Bamidbar, Miriam and Aaron began to talk against Moshe. In other words, they were critical of Moshe, and it says because of his Cushite wife, for he had married a Cushite. Now, the question is, what were they critical of? Again, all the Midrash, since it doesn't say why, because he married a Cushite wife, well, of course. I mean, he married Zipporah. They knew Zipporah. Zipporah was part of his life for the whole history from before Yetziat Mitzrayim. So, what does all of a sudden Cushite wife have to do with this? So again, there's all midrashim that keep explaining things, but we're not going into it. When we get to Bamidbar and we get to this event, we'll analyze it. But the fact is, what we're concerned with now is she criticized, unfairly, unjustly criticized Moshe and said, has God spoken only through Moshe? Hasn't he spoken through us? What she was saying is, why are we not equal in prophecy to Moshe? God spoke to, remember at the the splitting of the sea when Moshe Az Yashir Moshe B'nai Israel, and right after the Az Yashir, it said, and Miriam took instruments and gathered all the women together, and it calls her Miriam HaNeviah. She was considered a Navi. In other words, she was doing what it is that God wanted her to do. So she's called a Navi, and of course, Aaron is called a Navi when um, God appoints Aaron to be the spokesman for Moshe. He says to him, Aaron will be your Navi. A prophet is a spokesman, someone who speaks up for God or for somebody else. So Aaron, Miriam says, we also were speaking up. I led the women in the Az Yashir, and of course, Aaron spoke to Pharaoh on a number of occasions as Moshe's spokesman. So, what's so special about Moshe? Okay. So God hears this, and the narrative has like a parenthetical statement. Moshe was very humble, more humble than anybody else on the face of the earth, and he should not be the target of criticism. So God says to Moshe and Aaron and Miriam, the three of them come out of the tent, and God's presence stood at the entrance of the tent, and he told Aaron and Miriam to step forward. And he said to them, You're not you're not equal to Moshe. When I speak to Moshe, I speak to him face to face clearly. I speak to him directly. I don't speak to him in dreams or riddles or images like I do to any other prophet, including you, Aaron and Miriam. Why are you not afraid to speak against my servant Moshe? Why uh, why don't you respect him? He is different from you. I have a different relationship with you, and you have no right to speak against him. You're essentially, he's accusing them of being arrogant and prideful and putting down Moshe because he didn't marry. He married a Cushite. He didn't marry within the Bnei Israel. So the anger burned against them, and he left them. And when the cloud lifted, lo and behold, Miriam had tsarat. And Aaron turned towards her, saw that she had tsarat, and became very afraid that she is in danger. So he turned to Moshe and he said, uh, accept our apology. Don't hold against us the sin we have foolishly committed. We're sorry. We're sorry we criticized you. Don't let her be like a stillborn infant coming out of the mother's womb with flesh. With a stillborn, apparently, when the flesh of a stillborn is like white, it's not developed. And he said, don't let her become like that. And Moshe cried out to God, the famous 5-word appeal, please heal her, Rafa Nala. And God said, I didn't bring the rest of the story, but God said, well, no, because she insulted you and she insulted me, and I'm not going to let her off the hook by healing her immediately. She has to leave the camp for 7 days, like a Metzorah. She has to be sequestered for 7 days, and then she can come back, and then we can go on from there. But God said he sort of stuck up for Moshe. Moshe was so humble. He said, okay, don't be angry at her. I forgive her. And God said, no, I'm not forgiving the insult. And she has to leave the camp for 7 days. Okay, so that's one event. But there are two more events, not in the Chumash, but they're in Nach. But when we take all the events together, we're going to come out with a theory that's going to explain everything. The other second event is a Divrei Hayamim about King Uzziah. he's a powerful king of Israel. And like all the kings of Israel, he was an idol worshiper as well as a worshiper of God, synchronistic. He worshipped everybody. And he was the text says he was powerful, but his pride led to his downfall. That's our clue, that it's his pride that led to his downfall. How so? He was unfaithful to God, and he entered the temple to burn incense on the altar of incense. In other words, he said, look, I'm the king. I can do whatever I want. So I'm going to go in to the temple and I'm going to offer the incense just like you guys do, just like the Kohen does. Okay? And Azariah, who was the priest, took 80 other courageous priests, courageous because the king could tell his soldiers to kill the priests if they disagree with him. But Azariah took a whole bunch of priests and they confronted him and they said, hey, listen, king, this is not right for you to burn incense. Only the priests have the right to burn the incense, the priests who are the descendants of Aaron. And they're the only ones who can do that. So you better leave the sanctuary because you have violated this principle. You've been unfaithful to God's law and you will not be honored by God. So Uzziah had the censer in his hand. He's ready to burn the incense. He became angry at the priests. And while he was raging at the priests, tsarat broke out on his forehead. And when Azariah, who was the chief priest, and all the other priests looked at him, they saw he had tsarat, and they hurried him out because everybody knew that if somebody had tsarat, he was tameh. And if you're tameh inside the Mishkan, that's a death penalty on the spot. Even a Kohen who is tameh would die. So anybody who is tameh would die, and so they hurried him out, and he himself was eager to leave because he saw God had afflicted him with tsarat. And so Uzziah had this tsarat. It never healed until the day he died. He was considered tameh. He could never go near the Mishkan, the Mishkan again, the Mikdash again. He could never offer offerings. He had to stay away because he was considered a Metzorah and excluded from the Mikdash. And his son, Yotam, had charge of the palace and governed the people of the land. In other words, he became like a Metzorah. He became somebody who was not allowed to be in the precincts of Jerusalem. And of course, he was the king, but he couldn't be the king anymore in Jerusalem because he wasn't allowed in Jerusalem since he was a Metzorah. Okay, so that's another example of how pride and arrogance and not listening to God has caused his downfall, and its expression of that sin, as it were, is tsarat. And here's a third case. This is the case of Naaman. Naaman was a commander of the king of Aram. Aram was the enemy of Israel in the north and would always attack Israel, and the kings of Israel would always have to fight Aram, and they were always in battle. Now, Naaman was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded. He was a general commander of the army because through him God had given victory to Aram. In other words, when God wanted to punish the Bnei Israel, and he did, he punished them often because they were all idol worshippers. All the kings were idol worshippers, and so God gave the power of Aram to be victorious over the northern kingdoms. So Naaman considered himself a great warrior. We know is because God gave him victory, but he didn't consider it that way. He considered, he's the great commander of the army, and that's why they could always beat Israel. So he was a valiant soldier, but he had tsarat. Now, bands from Aram had gone out and taken captives. So Aram had, when you go to war, you have you take hostages. So they took a captive, a young girl uh, from from Israel, from the Shomron, and she served. She was a servant to Naaman's wife. So she said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria. If only your husband Naaman would see this prophet who lives in the northern kingdom, he would cure him of his tsarat." She was referring to Elisha because Elisha was the miracle worker like Eliyahu. And she said Elisha could cure him. And in fact, the king of Israel at the time uh, wrote to Naaman and encouraged him to seek out Elisha. He didn't write to he didn't write to Naaman, the commander of the army. He wrote to the king of Aram to convince Naaman to go see Elisha. When Elisha, the man of God, heard the king of Israel had torn his robes and sent his message, the king of Israel was very afraid. If you don't listen to Elisha, so he tore his robes and he says, I you've got to send Naaman to Elisha. So Elisha says to the king of Israel, "Why have you torn your robes? Why are you so depressed? Don't worry about it. Have Naaman come to me, and I'll cure him, and he'll know that there is a prophet in Israel. He'll know how great God is." So Naaman went with his horses because his own king, in other words, the king of Israel, encouraged the king of Aram to send Naaman to Elisha. So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. And look what happens. Elisha sent a messenger to say to him, "Go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored. You'll be cleansed. You'll be cured." Now look, Elisha didn't even come out to meet him. He sent a messenger. Now that's chutzpah as far as Naaman was concerned. Naaman is this great commander in chief of the army, and Elisha doesn't even honor him to come out and meet him. Okay, so what is Naaman's reaction to this message? Naaman went away angry, and he said, "Well, I thought he, meaning Elisha, would surely come out to meet me and stand and call the name of God, his God, and wave his hand over the spot and cure me of my skin disease." So, Naaman says, "What kind of chutzpah is this? He doesn't even come out. He doesn't even call on his God. He doesn't make a miracle for me. He tells me to go into the Jordan River. That's ridiculous. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, which is in Aram, they're better than the waters of Israel. The Jordan River is nothing compared to the major rivers of Damascus and Syria. Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed?" So he turned off and went off in rage. He said, "I forget this prophet. I'm going back home. This is a bunch of nonsense." And he wants to turn around and leave. But Naaman's servants went to him and said, "Look, don't be so impulsive, my master. If the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you have not done it? What if he told you to do offer 20 sacrifices and do all of that? Wouldn't you do that? So how much more then when he tells you do something simple, just go into the Jordan River, just be washed. So go dunk in there. What's the big deal?" So Naaman said, "Okay, you're right. It's no big deal." So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God told him, as Elisha told him, and lo and behold, his flesh was restored, and he became clean like that of a young boy. So Naaman and all his attendants went back to Elisha, stood before him, and said, "Now I know that there is no God in all of the world except in Israel." In other words, now that I know your God is the most powerful God in the world. Please accept now a gift from your servants. So Naaman he became a Baal Tshuva here. He became, he was sorry he was so angry that he didn't believe in Elisha. And now he says, I know that you're a man of God, and your God is the most powerful God. So let me give you a gift for what you did for me. And Elisha said, as surely as God lives, I will not accept a thing. And even though Naaman urged him, he refused. He said, I'm not taking anything. I'm I'm just doing it because I'm God's prophet and I don't want to get anything for it. Okay, but that's not the end of the story. Here's where it becomes interesting. So he said to Naaman, okay, go in peace, I'm taking nothing. So after Naaman had traveled some distance, Gehazi, who is the servant of Elisha, said to himself, my master, Elisha, um, uh, is too easy on Naaman. Um, this um, Naaman is this leader of the army of Aram, and by not accepting from him what he brought, he's letting him off too good. He should have taken gold and silver and showed that he's stronger, that he's more important than Naaman. So he said, my master is acting like a friar. So I'm going to do what he should have done. As surely as God lives, I will run after him and get something from him. So Gehazi ran after Naaman. And when Naaman saw him running, he got off his chariot and he said, is everything okay? And Gehazi, yes, everything is okay, but my master sent me to say, two young men from the company of prophets have come to me from the hill country of Ephraim. In other words, two people have come to my school of prophets. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 sets of clothing. Now, Gehazi made this up. Elisha never said this. So Gehazi is lying, but he wants to get stuff from Naaman. So he made up the story, and he said, give me some silver and give me some clothing. So Naaman said, of course, take the silver, because I offered it to Elisha. He didn't want to take it, so please take it. He urged Gehazi to accept them. He tied up the 2 talents of silver in 2 bags with 2 sets of clothing. He gave them to his servants, and they carried them ahead of Gehazi. But when Gehazi came to the hill, he didn't want anybody to see what he had. So he took the things from the servants, put them away in his house, and he sent the men away, and they left. So not only has Gehazi lied, but he has taken this for himself. He didn't give it to Elisha. He didn't take it to Elisha. He did it for himself. Then he went in and stood before Elisha. And Elisha says to him, oh, Gehazi, where have you been? And Gehazi, oh, me? I didn't go anywhere. Another lie. And Elisha said, do you know who you're talking to? Was not my spirit with you when the man got down from his chariot to meet you? Don't you think I don't know what really happened? Is this the time to take money, or to accept clothes, or our olive groves, vineyards, and flocks? If he had offered him all of this stuff, he would have taken it. Is this time for you to lie and for you to take stuff where I told him not to give me anything? And what happened? Naaman's tsarat, says Elisha, will cling to you and to your descendants forever. Then Gehazi went from Elisha's presence, and he was a Metzorah, as white as snow, for the rest of his life. And by the way, the text doesn't tell us this, but the Medrash says, if you remember the Haftorah for this Parsha, it's about the 4 lepers who were outside the camp. I can't tell you the whole story. It takes too long. But the Medrash says the 4 lepers that it's talking about were Gehazi and his 3 sons, who had tsarat for the rest of their lives, and they had to be like Uzziah. They were outside. They had to be outside the community for the rest of their lives. Okay, so now let's put the theme together. All these three cases. Number one, all the three cases show that there is arrogance, selfishness, and jealousy. Arrogance from King Uzziah, selfishness from Gehazi, jealousy from Miriam. They all defied authority. The king didn't listen to the Kohanim. Gehazi didn't listen to his boss, uh, Elisha. And Miriam was critical of Moshe in God's presence. They all were sinning against God's teachings or his prophets. And therefore, now here's the therefore. What's the common denominator to all three? And therefore, what is tsarat? Tsarat is not a medical issue. This is a spiritual disease, and it's a sign of God's displeasure. God is not pleased at any one of these people for what they did. The crime is a social crime against others, based on arrogance, jealousy, or selfishness, which is also considered a crime against God. In other words, what we're dealing with and the way we have to change our thinking to understand what's going on in the Parsha and the treatment of somebody who has tsarat is that person has a sign of God's displeasure on them called tsarat, and the crime in all cases is a social crime. It's against other people. And generally, and it's going to be based on either arrogance, jealousy, or selfishness. Okay, so that's the way to look at it. That this is a spiritual crime, a spiritual social crime, which is manifest through the person having tsarat. Now let's go back to the symptoms and see if everything makes sense. The Torah does not treat this as a chronic, contagious medical skin disease like leprosy, because it's an acute, non-contagious spiritual disease. Thus, the Kohen, who's in charge of the spiritual things, he's not medical, or he has no medical or healing abilities. He's the one in charge of the person to diagnose and treat this spiritual disease, because that's his job. The Kohen is relating to the people in a spiritual way about Tuma and Tara. Why is it a disease of the skin only visible? Because social attractiveness is associated with appearance. In other words, why is the disease only appearing on places visible, like the face and the hands and the feet? Because it's punishment for hurtful social behavior. And so when the person is in the community and other people look at him and they see that he has this tsarat on where they can see it, on his face, on his hands, on his legs, he appears socially repugnant and unattractive. In other words, they look at him and they say, oh, this person is a social misfit. He's done something against other people. We don't want anything to do with him. In other words, they shun the person who has these signs because they see it as him committing social crimes. This visible social unattractiveness confronts the offender with his crime, which cannot be ignored. You see, when the person is in the community and he sees everybody keeps their distance because they don't want anything to do with him, what they're doing is confronting him with his social crime. In other words, they're making him think about what he's doing and why he has tsarat. So the treatment plan now starts to make sense. The therapeutic treatment is social isolation for weekly periods during which the Kohen monitors the healing process. In other words, the Kohen doesn't heal him. He has to heal himself. He was in a forced retreat for self-confrontation and self-evaluation. In other words, by him having tsarat, and by him having the experience of everybody keeping their distance from him and looking down on him because he has committed a crime against their fellow citizens, so he has to look at himself. He has to confront himself and he has to say to himself, what is it that I did wrong that resulted in my having this tsaras and everybody shunning me? If healing begins, which indicates he is in fact self-reflecting and regretting and wanting to change his behavior, then the Kohen says, well, this is good. I'm going to give him another extra week to continue self-reflection and sort of doing tshuva and committing to changing his behavior. But if no healing begins, but rather the disease spreads all over his entire body, it indicates that there is no self-improvement. There's no self-reflection, that the person is ignoring what he's doing and not wanting to change anything. So in such a case, continuing social isolation is meaningless. It's like in therapy. If somebody's in therapy and they start to change, so they continue on in therapy. It's working. But if they're in therapy and nothing happens and they don't want to confront anything and they don't want to change, then there's no point in continuing. Then they go back into their community. But if they go back in their community, they're facing the continued public negative reaction, forcing him to self-reflect. In other words, this explains his presence as festivals, weddings, and other social gatherings. In other words, purposely, the Kohen sends him back in the community in order to force him to look at himself. Because while he's in the community, in all of these public gatherings, whether it's weddings or the holidays, he is seeing that everybody is avoiding him and everybody is looking at him disparagingly, and that's supposed to force him to start self-reflecting. So when healing begins under such public social rejection, he's ready to be sent back into isolation for therapeutic progress, and the cycle begins again. In other words, once there is healing, whenever the Kohen sees that there's healing, then it's useful to send him back into social isolation in order for him to self-reflect and start regret what he's doing, recognize, commit that he has to change his behavior. Now, why the manifestation of the disease not only on the skin? In other words, this makes sense when it appears on your skin and it has this effect socially. But what about on houses and garments? What is that about? So Hirsch says, because each one represents a focus on the target of the social crime. If it's on the person's body, then it reflects offensive social behavior of the core personality of the person. So the person may be, that's why it's associated midrashically with this big category of lashon hara. Why does a person get tsarat from lashon hara? They take it from Miriam, but not this kind of analysis. But it's any kind of social behavior that is the source is the person's own arrogance or the person's own sense of pride that puts down others. If so, then tsaras appears on the person. If it's on his garments, garments reflect the person's social role. Remember, we said that when we're talking about the garments of the Kohen Gadol, it reflects the social role of the person, his occupation, If he's a dentist, he wears a dentist outfit. He's a doctor, he wears a white jacket. If he's a soldier, he wears a uniform. So garments represent a social role. So the focus, if it saras appears on a person's garments, it means that the offense stems from the person's social role. He may be a employer. If he's an employer and he exploits his employees, or he doesn't treat his employees in a menschlich way, then the tsaras appears on his garments, which means it's about look at your social role. That's where the problem is. And similarly, if the tsarat appears in a house, it means the focus of the offense, the social offense, is domestic. It has to do with his behavior towards his spouse or towards his child. And so, depending on where the tsaras is, it gives the person the focus of where to look to be able to see himself and what he's doing and his need to change his behavior. So that is that's the analysis, the Hirschian analysis of what tsaras is, and it fits the data, and it's a brilliant analysis. In fact, okay, everybody clear?
Yeah, thank you very much. That was very interesting perspective because
Enlightening.
there's so many interpretations and explanations. This one was a little more unique.
Right. This one accounts for the data. That's the whole point.
Yes.
In other words, if you look at the details, whatever you come up with has to fit all these details. Each of the details have to make sense. And this way of looking at it is accounts for everything that we read in the text. Okay, we will continue again in Yirtzeh Hashem next week with Acharei Mot.